Philosophical Essay 1. Number 3 plays a significant role in the cognitive theorizing of the American philosopher and original inventor of the precepts of pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce. And although his writings on the philosophical method and approach of pragmatism are very accessible, understood with little difficulty, as in his essay, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, his thought on triadic conceptualization was not written for the intellectually faint of heart. He put forth the notion that the fullest understanding possible for a human being must first pass through the dialectical before any triadic conceptualization can occur. And on this essential count I tend to be in agreement, since only the resolution of the dialectical from which issues forth, or can issue forth, a synthesis, Hegel, is without doubt necessary prior to any inception of triadic-infused cognition. I would not say that my personal understanding, for at bottom all understanding is personal, of Peirce is deeply flawed, shooting myself not even in my foot but in my knee. But I would and do admit to the fact that this understanding of Peirce, on my part, is inadequate and still piecemeal. Obviously, to render this defect of inadequate knowledge moot, I would have to read Peirce's major works far more thoroughly than I have in the past when I first came across a volume of his writings at the green age of 23 in 1975. But an altogether different approach might be profitable, and that is to simply reflect upon what I presently grasp he was attempting to get at. First of all, he saw the whole of the scientific enterprise, and certainly his own work concerning the philosophy of science, to be a vast process of development. No idea could remain fixed or unchallenged. He went so far as to suggest that the architectonic system building in philosophy was a thing of the past. And here he coincides with the continental philosopher Edmund Husserl, founder of phenomenology. In terms of history, these two men were nearly contemporaries, with one practicing philosophy in the United States, while the other was doing so in Germany or perhaps Vienna. To first see and then pursue the evidence was the watchword shared equally by them, both of whom had decidedly a scientific cast of mind. With Husserl, this is clearly seen merely in the title of his final published work, The Crisis of the European Sciences. Apropos of the foregoing, I should note my personal reaction to what some may choose to regard, as I do here, Peirce's esotericism in his discussion of thirds, and what I've dubbed as his notion of triadic cognition. Martin Heidegger is perhaps Husserl's most famous, some would say infamous, student, apart from Ortega y Gasset, who also stayed in Heidelberg for a time and attended Husserl's lectures as well. But whereas Ortega's writings are quite accessible, Heidegger's most decidedly are not. The latter's work has been viewed by many to be all but inaccessible, owing to the man's so-called oracular style and his penchant for esotericism, while Peirce struggled to devise and elucidate a coherent and internally consistent architecture of thought. which in my view borders on esotericism, Heidegger, a generation later, deliberately indulged in it, living like a monk in a mountain retreat built out of stone while his contemporary Ortega was augmenting his academic work with short essays and vignettes in a Madrid newspaper. But then Ortega was far more interested in openly discussing the fomenting politics of Europe in the 1920s and 30s, whereas Heidegger capitulated to Hitler to save his own skin, just as did the Norwegian novelist Knut Hamsun, a Nobel Prize winner for literature who was later pilloried for his endorsements of Hitler. But this sort of capitulation to Nazi propaganda and terror tactics was fairly common at the time, for example, the many French civilians who, rather than fight on France's resistance movement, chose instead the far easier route of capitulation, even to the point of betraying many of the Jewish citizens of France. When a prominent, well-known thinker has been confronted by the threat of personal harm, and both Germany and the Soviet Union, and most certainly in Mao's China, can supply countless examples of this, self-preservation naturally takes precedent over continued adherence to one's inherent moral nature. The dreadful machinations and tactics conducted by the prolific henchmen within all three of these authoritarian governments frequently used ever more frightening measures of terror. And it remains easy for an armchair critic to belittle such men as Heidegger and Hamsun for their having caved in to the juggernaut of fascism, especially now, 90 years after the horrific events which led up to World War II. I was born 7 years after the end of that war, when the Cold War involving England, France, East and West Germany, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and not least the United States, had gotten well underway. Any political philosophy which supports or advocates violence to further its objectives is utterly bankrupt and should be despised. And of course, I say this as an American with the fractured political system people in the United States are having to deal with at present, at this very moment.